Hi, I'm Jake Ray, and today on the Student Slant, we talk to Everdeen Mason, an audience editor at the Washington Post, about the importance of analytics to a news organization.
So I started the Lantern. I started writing at the Lantern as a sophomore. I did the whole thing. I was campus editor and then editor in chief. And then when I graduated, I had an internship at the Cleveland Plain Dealer, which was my dream paper at the time. And they had just cut their internship program from 10 people to like three. So I felt really lucky to get it. And I think it was an 8 or 10 week program, and they weren't hiring, but I managed to just like sort of linger basically for like 4 months until they finally were like, we're not going to be able to hire you. I was like eyeballing like women going on maternity leave, people going on vacation, hoping I could like slide into that spot and hold on a little longer. So then I ended up getting a job with Cox Media Group. So that's Springfield News Sun, Dayton Daily News. And I actually started out as their health and education reporter, but then after a couple of months, they moved me to the business side. And so I was covering manufacturing, labor economics, and 2010 was a really interesting time to do those things, especially because Springfield was a town that was like decimated by like layoffs from one plant. So that was a really great experience. And so I did that for 3 years. And then, just kind of the time that I was kind of getting pay cuts every year. And it became clear that I was going to have to go to a bigger market if I wanted to not just move up, but also make a little more money. So I moved to New York. I worked at a trade pub for a little bit. I worked at the Wall Street Journal on their corporate finance desk. And I was getting really burned out on business reporting and breaking news. At the Wall Street Journal, my job was I would be in by 5:30, and starting at 6, you'd get this fire hose of like SEC releases and press releases from companies. And so I would end up writing like 6 to 10 stories a day. And I then, when the rush was over around like noon or one, I would kind of prep for what we thought was coming the following day with some information and some shells so I could write them faster. And it wasn't a super pleasant job, and a stronger person would have held on for longer. And I was like, I don't, and at the same time, I had this real like appetite for the kind of journalism that I was reading from other sites. So this is like the heyday of like Gawker and Jezebel. The Hairpin, the All was so amazing. And so I'm reading these stories and I'm trying to figure out like why I don't get to do that. And then I was like, well, how do people even find my stuff? I wasn't even writing my own headlines at the time. Like my headlines were terrible. I had no idea what happened to my story after I like filed it, to my editor. And so I felt like this was a huge lack. And also I have very strong self-preservation instincts. So I was also like, well, if I can figure out how to get into digital media and how all this works, then I can be employed for a little bit longer. And so yeah, so I was a huge fan of a place, I still am, of a place called Refinery 29. It's a women's lifestyle website that was much smaller at the time, and now it's enormous. And I basically cold called them. I emailed their style editor at the time, Connie Wang, who is great. And I asked for an informational interview. And then once I got there, I ambushed and I was basically like, look, I can write, I can report, I have a news background. I think you guys are interested in that. I'm also really good with data. And so they're like, okay, we'll keep you in mind, whatever. And then a couple days later, they were like, hey, what do you know about SEO, search engine optimization? And I was like, yeah, I totally know how to do that, which was a lie. And I bought a book called The Art of Seo, and I read it from cover to cover. And I watched a bunch of like YouTube videos on Google Analytics, and you can sign up for all this stuff for free. I looked at Google Developers is a great resource, so I like read a bunch of forums, and then by the time I got to the interview stage, and they knew that they were going to have to teach me some of this stuff. But I want to present a good front, and I guess I did because I got the job. And I was working under a woman named Rebecca Smith, who's now one of the managing editors at Refinery 29, and she's incredible. And so I was basically taught search, but beyond that, analytics and just kind of how to think about the back end of stories and that intersection between, editorial content and algorithms and product by this guy named Hank Azarian, who was a contractor at Refinery for a long time, who kind of had single-handedly sort of gotten them in this SEO game, and that's been his like job for a while. Kind of a mysterious guy. I just like got to learn from like a master for 2 years and got paid to do it. So once that happened, had a great time. Refinery was really fun. And I was snooping on a competitor on Slate because I thought that some of the stuff that they did was something that the Refinery could maybe do someday if they got the right staffing. And so they were going to hire an audience team, and I saw it on Twitter from a guy named Ryan Kellett, who is the head of audience development at the Washington Post. So I direct messaged him, and I think I emailed him, and I was like, hey, what do you know about this job? And he said, I don't know anything about that, but do you want to work at the Washington Post? So we started talking, and so I really lucked out in that I got to create a position for myself. I wrote my own memo, and Ryan was really sold on this, so he helped me edit this memo. I interviewed, I got the job, and then once I got to the Post, I was like, okay, I'm so excited. I'm just going to do exactly what I did at Refinery. And that was foolish. It was like I had to learn everything all over again. And just the sheer scale of the Post and the some of the technology that I was used to having and some of those resources I didn't have anymore. And so it was kind of like starting from scratch. But that was really good. I got to work my way around the room, and I kind of got to grow beyond just sort of like my SEO expertise and really start to meld together all of my interests. So now I do kind of broad scale like digital strategy. I'm a person that an editor might come to and say, I want to make a proposal to go into a different content lane in my subsection or for my blog, and I want to do these kinds of stories, and then I can do like a really deep analysis for them. I can do competitor research. I can help them figure out if they want to go in that direction after all, where they fit into the broader conversation, where they fit into the sort of ecosystem of journalism and features and clickbait that's out there floating around, and really help advise people. So I get to work, obviously I work with audience, I work with social media, I still do SEO stuff, I work with assignment editors and section heads. I have a good relationship with our managing editor of digital, so I get to do a lot of weird like task forcey type stuff. If they're like, we just want to like think about this area for a minute, I might be a person who gets to be in that room and kind of think about what ifs all day. So it's been really fun, and now this is year 3 at the Post. I'm Everdeen Mason. I'm an audience editor at the Washington Post.
And I'm Jake Ray, and this is the Student Slant. For our listeners who don't know, in a basic way, what is analytics?
So analytics basically are, it's just a record of how people are engaging with a web page, basically, or with an item online. You can trace every action that a person takes. So if they click on a story from Twitter, for example, I can record that and look at those analytics and figure out information about, how that story resonated with a person.
For the Lantern, we have 2 separate audiences, and that's really how newspapers use analytics, is to kind of figure out their audiences and target content. We have one that's more of a faculty base, and then more of a student base, and the content they want is very different. So how at the Washington Post do you guys, because you have a massive audience of several different people who want all different types of content, how do you figure out who and what you're writing to and what you're writing?
So I think this is something that, even at the Post, we're still struggling with. We're a very generalized audience, and we try to write for that. But the thing that we're most known for is obviously our politics and our national news. And so we know that audience very well, but we also write a ton of other stuff that people like. And I think a lot of this comes from, sort of the paper mentality. People get a product and they don't necessarily get to choose what they read. I mean, they can choose what they read on the page, obviously, but they don't get to choose the mix necessarily of what they read that day. And so what the internet has done for us is that people can essentially they can basically curate their own front pages. They can pull from any source, they can pull from any person to figure out and entertain themselves and learn what they want to learn. And so I think that when we think about content mixes, I think it's okay to think about it a little bit like that. It's okay to write stories that are targeted for your faculty audience, and to know like what that looks like in traffic, right? So say your faculty audience is a certain size, then you know that a story targeted to them should perform at a certain level. So let's say um, a normal faculty story gets like 10,000 page views, right? So if it does that, then you feel good. But let's say a normal story that you've been targeting to the student body, of which there's a lot more of them, a normal story for the student audience gets like 50,000. So you wouldn't want to like hold your stories that you're targeting for your faculty audience to the same scale as your student stories. Does that kind of make sense?
Mhm.
I think a lot of people don't really think about it that way, and everyone's really competitive. Everybody wants to get as many readers as they possibly can, but I think that we're kind of in this age of like sort of peak scale where people only have so much time. There's so much out there, and really what we should be focused on is trying to like actually engage with the people that we want and take that extra step. For the post, that looks like people subscribing. For the lantern, that might look for like people signing up for an email newsletter. That might look like people reading, one unique reader reading 5 lantern stories in a given time period. It might look like having a really robust comment section. And by robust, I don't mean like a lot of comments. I mean people actually interacting with each other. So you can kind of choose how you measure that engagement, but that lets you know that you've really like touched those people, and that they are really interested in your stuff.
Would you say it's kind of like a guessing game, or do you think it's more, or analytics kind of giving you like a map on which way to go?
It's an educated guessing game. So I always tell people, especially when I'm training people at the post, that basically you use analytics to kind of like sharpen your intuitions, right? So I work with incredible journalists who have been doing this for 10, 15, 20 years, right? And all of that experience is really valuable, and that's experience that I don't have. So the analytics side can really just help like sharpen that to a really fine edge and like give you a lane to run in. So it's not such an open world, because really you could write about anything. You could put everything out there. You could try all sorts of things, but I think with scientific method, like right, you would set up a host of variables, and you would have a control, and you would test those things up against that control. And so analytics allows you to do that in a much easier way.
From sort of like an advisory standpoint of telling reporters what they need to write and kind of giving them what they need to know to write the best stories that they can for their own want to get reads. How do you balance the kind of struggle between not putting out, I guess, clickbait to really just refining a story into something that is what people are really looking for?
So that goes into that kind of falls into different things. So I may have a reporter who contacts me who says, I am writing about X. How can I make sure that this does well on search? Right. And so then I might help them work on a headline, or I might help them work on keywords, or I might like say, actually, I think that people are interested in this instead of this. Or I would say, the story will perform really well on Facebook, actually. I don't necessarily think it's a Google story. So that's kind of the extent of my interaction with reporters. Where I really engage is with editors, and that normally is going to happen before a story is necessarily like jumped on. And so, an editor might say, okay, it's actually sort of a lot of air traffic control too, because the post is so sprawling that sometimes we even compete with ourselves. And so, for example, when, I don't know, like a celebrity dies, like everyone has a way to like enter that story, and it's more kind of like guiding people so that they're not all like crashing into each other. So it's like we already have a social media reactions piece in style. So like, why don't you kind of skew this in this other direction? Or like, we've noticed people are talking about this. So that's kind of like on the sort of breaking news real time front. I work a little bit more pulled back, like on the kind of long game of things. So people are more likely to kind of talk to me on a broader level of like, hey, I'm the foreign desk, and we really want people to engage with our stories about Boko Haram. Why aren't these doing better? And then we can kind of go from there and dive in. And I always work through the chain of command. So like, if I actually want a reporter to do something differently, unless I already have like a pre-existing relationship with that reporter, I always go to their editor. And so I'll go to them and say like, hey, do you think that we can add this line. I think that people are really interested in that. Or can we change your headline? I think the headline doesn't really get at what people are looking for. And always bringing it back to the journalism. If you just like come in, swing in with like, I want us to beat CNN on Google, this is the headline. Like, that's not really gonna work. And also, I mean, it's just like literally always about the journalism and making sure that readers understand like the value of what they're getting, like from your headline and like deck or from the photo, that they understand like why this is the story that they should read as opposed to everyone else's story or in addition to other people's stories.
You just spoke in Nicole Kraft's news media and writing course. You mentioned that game of trying to get the top story on Google. It's sort of like Battleship. How do
Yeah.
you kind of maneuver that game and try to get your story to the top? Like for the Lantern, it almost seems like an impossible thing to do is to get your story to the top unless it's a very focused Ohio State story.
Yeah.
But you're focusing on national style news. So how do you kind of compete with those other large organizations?
Well, I'm lucky in that obviously the Washington Post has just like an enormous amount of domain authority on like all of the big stuff. So
Mhm.
it makes it a little bit easier. But honestly, the thing about search that people don't really, I think that people often misunderstand is that like it is like a long range weapon, but people use it like in a very short term capacity. And so if I want to win, I actually had to have like seeded the path forward like earlier, like as early as possible. So if so one reason why you guys can do really well and rank really well on Ohio State stuff is because the Lantern probably has an extremely high domain authority on Ohio State because you write about it all the time and Google understands that you have this depth of knowledge. But if like tomorrow you wanted to start writing about, I don't know, the self-care industry, right? You're gonna have to plot out how to get to a point where you can rank on that, and that's going to be through like a really strategic like release of stories, right? You're going to have to start writing about it, and you're going to have to start writing about it a decent amount and not have it be spammy, and it has to be well optimized. It has to be you have to show how important it is to your site, so you have to like make sure that you're linking to it and that like every now and then it gets on your homepage, it gets as close to the domain as possible. So that's kind of how I think about it. And so in a breaking news situation, someone might come to me and be like, I fully expect us to rank X, Y, and Z. In my head, I might know that that's not even possible. So at that point, it's just managing expectations. Other times, I might be like, okay, we should be able to like do this, and here are like my recommendations. Or it's even at the stage of like, okay, so how many stories are we going to do on this? Because I can't get all like 18 stories that we're going to rate on this to be number one on Google, right? One of them is going to get like rank on page one, and we might get another one to be in that top stories carousel. So like, what's it gonna be? Like, what are my best options? And so then I'm gonna lean on those, and I'm not gonna worry so much about the other stories. So that's kind of my thought process when I'm confronted with that in a real time basis.
With a journalism background, understanding things like news value and things like that, how do you think that's helped you in your analytics role of figuring out what needs to be priority and what people want to see?
I think it's everything. So the Post actually has a separate analytics team, and I work with them actually pretty closely. And they can obviously do things that I can't. Like I don't know how to use R or Python, so I don't often have access to the data warehouse. Although they built me a thing so I can do my own polls easier, which is really nice. So that made me feel really special. So one of the interesting case studies of this is one of my partners at Refinery, who now no longer works there either. We both have kind of taken off on similar trajectories, but we have like different values. And so mine is that like I think that analytics has to have an editorial component, and that I can only do my job because I'm housed with editorial, and that's the lens through which I view everything, and do search and all of that. She is on the side that she is marketing, and she should not have like she can't do the purest like best work if she has to take into account these editorial considerations. And so I think that kind of illustrates like the two sides of the coin. So what I like about having this journalism background to do that kind of stuff is analytics can be used to incentivize behaviors, right? And so if I know that the goal of the newsroom is to do more of a certain kind of story, or to, have longer stories, for example, or shorter stories, I can use analytics to bear that out and say, like, hey, like, this is what we see when you do X, Y, and Z. So that's a really nice way to be able to use it. It also means that I can talk to, journalists are surprisingly like spooked by numbers sometimes, even though we should absolutely not be. And so, they get these editors get like 5 analytics reports just automatically in their inbox, and sometimes they just ignore them because they don't know what they should be looking at and they don't know what it means. It also causes a lot of angst, especially when you're in a newsroom that has everything from a home and garden section to like the Fix blog that's writing about politics, right? And so you're writing about like how to keep your succulents alive, and you're looking at the front page of Chartbeat and you're like, my story's not on there, right? And like, how does that make you feel and how does that make you want to engage? So like, it's about being able to create goals that are achievable for people that incentivize the kind of work that they want to do, and helps them make it better. And I think I can only do that because I've been in their shoes. I have written crappy headlines. I have felt that like I didn't care about the story I was writing. Like I've had an editor make a change that I'm like, it's ruined forever. That comma should have been a semicolon. It's, like I've been there. And so I think it kind of allows me to be able to talk a little bit more colloquially with the editors and reporters as well.
That was a great discussion. Be sure to check back next week for more student perspective on the Student Slant.